morning. Happy Easter to all of you. We've got a lot of longtime members here today. And we got a lot of visitors today. We've got seekers here today. And I'm sure we've got a few doubters here today. I'm sure there's a few people here today who just aren't really sure about this whole Jesus thing. Probably a few people here today who are 100% convinced that Christianity is a bunch of nonsense. We got a lot of different kinds of people here today. But please hear me when I say that every one of you is welcome here. Your belief in Jesus is welcome here. Your questions about Jesus are welcome here. Your doubts about Jesus are welcome here. No matter what your position on Christianity is, we're just honored that you be part of this experience today. In fact, I want to speak specifically to the doubters for a moment. I want to speak to the doubters for a moment because I spent half my life doubting all this stuff. In fact, I was pretty convinced that none of this stuff was real. I was convinced that a man named Jesus really lived, and I was convinced that he was a good man, a moral man, a spiritual leader of his people. But all that stuff about him being the Son of God and doing all these miracles and dying on a cross and then walking out of the tomb, well, let's just say I had serious doubts about all that stuff. And I decided to investigate. You see, because the most ignorant thing that a person can do is decide that something is true or false without examining all of the evidence. So I decided to examine Christianity. I investigated the claims of this book, and a really unexpected thing happened. The more I investigated the claims of this book, the more I discovered the truth of this book. And the more I discovered the truth of this book, the more I wanted to live my life according to this book. And the more I lived my life according to this book, the more amazing my life became. I started living with more power and more purpose than I ever had before. And then one day I looked up, and for the first time in my life, I was really proud of my life. For the first time in my life, I was deeply satisfied with the person that I was becoming. Spent half my life as a doubter. Then I investigated the claims of this book. And then I became a believer. And then my whole life was transformed. And all I could say was, wow. Wow. Well, today we come to Easter Sunday. And wow is a pretty good word to describe what Christians believe happened on that first Easter Sunday. And so what I want to do today is, I want to kind of walk you back in time a little bit. And I'm going to need you to use your imagination with me today. So if you will, imagine that you were around 2,000 years ago, and this man named Jesus came, and you listened to what he taught. And nobody had ever taught like he taught. Nobody had ever lived like he lived. Nobody had ever loved like he loved. And so you decided that you wanted to follow this man. And you gave up everything to do it. You left your home, you left your work, you left your community, you left everything behind to follow Jesus. And people told you were crazy for doing that, but you didn't care. because you knew that this was the best opportunity you were ever going to have. And you wanted what Jesus was offering, so you left everything behind to follow him. Well, for a while, it was an amazing adventure. Everywhere you went, crowds of people were there. And Jesus would teach them, and Jesus would heal them. And before long, everybody knew who Jesus was. And people started wondering if maybe he was the promised Messiah. Maybe this man was the Savior of Israel that they had been waiting for centuries. And the momentum just kept building and building, and his ministry kept growing and growing. His influence got wider and wider, and the crowds got bigger and bigger. And then one day, you go into Jerusalem. And the streets are just lined with people. And they're all shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." You see, they're shouting that because they want Jesus to be their king. They want Jesus to sit on the throne of Israel just like the great King David. Only Jesus has no intention of being that kind of king. Jesus had no intention of being their earthly king. And when the crowd started to figure that out, things went south really fast. By Friday of that week, this man that you believed in, this man that you left everything to follow, by Friday, he was dead. Only he wasn't just dead. You see, it was much worse than that. He was crucified on a Roman cross like a common criminal. It was a death of shame. It was a death of humiliation. It was a death of failure. You believed in this man. You left everything behind to follow him, and now he's dead. And you are in deep, deep despair. That happened on a Friday. On Sunday, you go to the tomb. You know, just to pay your last respects, try to get some closure. But when you arrive at the tomb, things are very confusing. The tomb appears to be empty. The stone at the entrance had been rolled away. The Roman guards who were posted there, they're gone. And there's this angel of God there. And the angel says to you, he is not here. He has risen. Amen? So you go start telling everybody this amazing news. You go tell everybody Jesus is alive. The crucified carpenter from Nazareth is alive. He was crucified. He was dead. He was buried. And now he is alive again. Amen. Now, what do you think people's first response was when they heard that Jesus was alive? What do you think people's first response was? See, because we have this very old tradition in the church. We do it every Easter, where the preacher will say, Jesus Christ is risen, and then all the people say, He is risen indeed. Let's do that again. Jesus Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Amen. You know, that's a beautiful tradition, but I don't think it's very accurate. Like when those first people heard that Jesus was alive, I don't think their response would have been that calm. When those first people heard that he was alive, when they saw Jesus alive, I don't think they would have said, he is risen indeed. I think they would have said, wow! 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 You see, wow is what we say when something happens that we never saw coming. Wow is what we say when something happens that turns our whole world upside down. And our world is filled with wow moments. In fact, our whole universe is built on wow. Whether you believe this world was created by the hand of God or whether you believe it was created by the Big Bang, either way, that was a wow moment, wasn't it? The moment of creation. One moment there was nothing, and the next moment there was something. Wow. And history is filled with wow moments. You know, one day the Wright brothers stepped into this machine and suddenly human beings were flying. Wow! There was that moment when Neil Armstrong took his first step on the surface of the moon. Anybody remember seeing that on TV? No. That's wow! What? There's a man on the moon! Wow! And your life is filled with wow moments. The moment I got on the stage and asked my wife to marry me, and she said yes. Wow. Wow. The moment we held our baby boy in our arms for the first time. Wow. 2 months ago, that little baby boy turned 16 and got his driver's license. Wow. Wow. Woo. Our world is filled with wow moments. Your life is filled with wow moments. But I am here today to talk to you about the greatest wow moment in all of human history. One moment, Jesus was dead, and the next moment, he was alive. It happened in a moment. We call it the resurrection, and it is the greatest single moment in all of human history. And I want to share 3 things with you today about the resurrection. They're really simple things. The first one is the resurrection actually happened. Yes. The second is the resurrection changes everything. Yes. And the third is the resurrection is deeply personal. Let's take that first one. The resurrection actually happened. My friends, this one is so important because there's this really commonly held idea out there about the resurrection these days, and this idea goes something like this. It goes that Jesus was probably a real man. He was probably a good man, probably a spiritual leader of his people, but still he was just a man. And people really missed him when he was gone. And they felt like his presence was somehow still with them. And so they made up the story about the resurrection just to keep the whole Jesus movement alive. You have to understand, a lot of people believe that these days. That the resurrection was a made-up story just to help people keep their faith alive. Now, I've got to tell you, that is not an unreasonable conclusion. It's not. It would be perfectly understandable if they just made up that story to keep people's faith alive. I would understand that. But here's what you need to know. For the people who actually wrote down the accounts of the resurrection, this was not a made-up story. This was not myth. This was not legend. This was not folklore. For the gospel writers, they present the resurrection of Jesus as though it actually happened. Now, there were a lot of writers around at the time, and a lot of those writers wrote myth. A lot of them wrote legend. A lot of those writers just made up stories. But then there were the writers who were serious about writing history, about writing what really happened. And for the writers of history, it was a very different thing than writing myth, or writing legend, or writing folklore. For one thing, the writers of history, they absolutely depended on eyewitness accounts. You know, people who were actually there, people who saw it with their own eyes, people who fought in the war. Whatever history they were writing about, they depended on eyewitness accounts. So the historical writing that we have from this period, it was written by people who were serious about getting it right, and they absolutely depended on eyewitnesses. And we see this all throughout the Gospels. Like this is from the Gospel of Luke. And I want you to notice how serious Luke is about his writing. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Now, whatever else you may think about this writing, this is intended to be taken seriously. That's why the eyewitnesses are mentioned, you see. If somebody was writing something that they claimed was the truth, they would always mention the eyewitnesses. And they would even tell you if those eyewitnesses were still alive. So that you could go do your own investigation. You could go check it out for yourself. Like in this example, from Mark chapter 15. It says, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Okay, so Mark says there's this guy named Simon, and Simon was forced to carry the cross of Jesus. Now that's a big claim, yes? That's a big claim to make. And Simon was a really common name in the ancient world. And so Mark's going to clarify his identity for you a little bit. For starters, he said this particular Simon was from a place called Cyrene. So this is Mark saying you can go there. So Simon's still, you can go to Cyrene. You can find this guy. Check it out for yourself. What I'm saying is true. And then Mark goes even farther. And he mentions the names of Simon's two sons. Now that was a really important detail because those two sons had become part of the Christian community. And they were around when Mark wrote his gospel. So this is Mark's way of saying, go talk to those guys. They're right over there. They're still alive. You can go talk to them. You can verify that my story is true. You see, eyewitness testimony was absolutely crucial for these ancient writers. And we find eyewitness testimonies all throughout the Gospels. And comes to Easter, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, all four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all give you the names of the eyewitnesses. They give you the names of the people who were first at the tomb and who first saw Jesus alive again. All four gospel writers tell you who the witnesses were. Now, I want to tell you what's fascinating about those first eyewitnesses. What's fascinating about all of the first eyewitnesses is they were all women. In each one of the gospel accounts, it is women who were first at the tomb, women who first realized that the tomb was empty. Women. Now that may not seem like a big deal to us today, but in the ancient world, that was a really big deal. Because women were not considered reliable witnesses. In fact, listen, in Israel and all throughout the Roman Empire, women were not even allowed to give testimony in a court of law. A woman's testimony was not trusted. And we see this dynamic at work in the Gospels. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Hey guys, just a minute, tune in for a minute. Can you believe there was a time when we didn't take women seriously? What were we thinking about, guys? Look, the women find the empty tomb. They go to the men. They tell the men, the tomb is empty. Jesus is risen. And the men say, fake news. Donald Trump wasn't the first one to say that. That's what the men said. Fake news. It wasn't until the men saw Jesus alive that they knew they could take this seriously. Now here's my point. Please don't miss the point of all this. If these stories about the resurrection were just made-up stories, then the people who wrote those stories never would have listed women as the first eyewitness. They never would, not one of the gospel writers would have made up women as the first eyewitness. Not one of them would have done that, and yet in all four gospels, it is women who were the first witnesses. Now there's only one reason that women would be listed as the first eyewitnesses, and that's because they were. That's because they were the first eyewitnesses. Listen, whatever else you may think about the resurrection of Jesus, the gospel writers present it as something that actually happened. And here's the next truth about the resurrection. The resurrection changed everything. Like I said, we all have those wow moments in our lives. Last year I took my two sons to Yosemite. Anybody ever been to Yosemite? That place is wow. Yeah. Anybody remember holding your first paycheck? Anybody remember that? That was a wow moment, wasn't it? And then you see how much the IRS took out. That's a whole different kind of wow. Our lives are filled with wow moments. But these wow moments in our lives, they come and go. The wow moments come and go, but the world keeps right on going. And our problems keep right on going. Life and death keep right on going. Well, once there was a man named Jesus, and he came, and he he taught like nobody else had ever taught. And he taught that God is real, and God is close, and God is personal. Jesus taught that not one sparrow can fall from its nest without God knowing, without God caring. And God is infinitely good, and God is infinitely powerful, and God is deeply invested in you. Jesus actually taught these things. But it wasn't just what he taught. See, Jesus did things that no man could do. With a touch from Jesus, a blind man could see. With a word from Jesus, a crippled man could walk. And so people followed Jesus. There was this amazing movement that just kept growing and growing for 3 years. And then Jesus died. And when Jesus died, his whole movement died with him. Like, understand this. Jesus died on a Friday, and on Saturday, the whole Jesus movement was over. It was over. His followers scattered. Their hope was dead. On Saturday, it was all over. And then came Sunday, and everything changed. See, a lot of people don't understand this. Christianity is unique among all the religions of the world because Christianity is the only religion that didn't develop slowly over time. When it comes to Christianity, one day it did not exist, and then the next day it did. I'll show you this in the Gospels. This is from Matthew 28. It says, "So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and they ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them. 'Greetings,' he said." I love how Jesus is so cool here. He's so casual. Like, he's not jumping up and down saying, "It's me, I'm back, I'm really alive." No, he just strolls up and says, "Greetings." Like, of course it's me. What else could you expect? "Greetings," Jesus said. And then look what happened. They came to him and they clasped his feet. They're on their knees, they're clasping his feet. And then look at this last part. And they worship. Oh, my dear friends, you have to get this. Yesterday, he was a crucified criminal. Yesterday, he was a failed Messiah. Yesterday, he was a dead man. Today, he's the Lord of the universe. And they worship him. Do you see? One day Christianity did not exist, and the next day it did. And for 2,000 years now, nations have risen and fallen. Empires have come and gone, but Christianity remains. The resurrection changed everything. And then here's the third truth about the resurrection. The resurrection is deeply personal. We all face this wonder in our lives. It's the wonder of being born and then having to face the moment of your own death. The biblical writers talked a lot about this. In the book of Hebrews, it says, just as man is destined to die once and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people. And he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Listen, he will appear again to bring salvation to who? To who? What does it say? To those who are waiting for him. Are you waiting for him? You see, the resurrection is deeply personal for you. And here's why. Because the biggest wow moment of your life, it hasn't happened yet. The most amazing moment of your life, for better or worse, is going to be the moment after you die. See, we don't talk about that much. But it's a good thing to think about once in a while. Especially at Easter time. Because that moment is coming for every one of us. That moment will come into your life when your life ends. And in that moment, something amazing is going to happen. Either you're going to see God, or you're going to face an eternity without God. Now, God doesn't want anybody to face eternity without him. God doesn't want you to face eternity without him. And so God comes to you and he says, you have known so much pain in your life. And you've made so many mistakes in your life. So I will offer you my grace. And I'll offer you my love and my forgiveness. And I will be with you in all the moments of your life. And when that moment comes, when your life ends, I will be there too. And you will live forever. Amen. That one moment after you die, take a moment and think about that moment. That moment after you die. What is that moment going to be like? You're either going to see God in that moment, or you're going to face an eternity without God. And you're going to know in that first moment after you die. But here's the good news. You don't have to wait until that moment to know. You can resolve that question right now, can't you, Pastor? You can decide right now to invest the rest of your life in Jesus, and then you'll know exactly what's going to happen in that moment after you die. Put your faith in the resurrection of Jesus. Celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, and one day, Jesus will celebrate the resurrection of you. Amen? We're going to have our time of invitation. If there is one here today who has not given his life to Jesus, if there's one here today who has questions or doubts that they would like answered, please come to the altar. Talk with one of the pastors. Talk with God. If you're a doubter, don't leave today without coming. If you're a believer, and you come here and thank God for the gift that you already know you have. But I can't think of any reason for you not to come here and end this service in a conversation with God. Will you come?